welcome to episode 64 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in smoky Napa Valley.
And John Denning in blisteringly hot Los Angeles.
Are you hot down there? What's hot in LA these days?
It's been in the 90s for the past week or two, which is, again, right out of my comfort zone.
Call me when it reaches 105 or higher.
I doubt I will. I'll be melted to a sidewalk.
Well, I'm in the land of smoke right now, and I'm actually really pleased it's just smoke and not fire, because there is a massive LNU complex fire burning very close to me. The evacuation zone's about a mile away, but we feel entirely safe. So it's a little crazy up here, but still not so bad, and it's certainly better than a lot of other people have it right now. Yeah. So I'm thankful.
You know, I'm tempted to say it's nothing you haven't seen before, but I think this year is fairly unprecedented, as I understand it.
Well, the last time you want to be driven out of your home is during a pandemic.
Well, but just the fires themselves, I've heard are like once in 100 years.
I don't know, man. 2017, there was huge fires. I don't know if you recall this, but we had to decamp down to San Francisco for a while to get out of the heavy smoke here. And we've been fortunate. The wind pattern is been drifting a lot of the smoke away from us. And like I said, a lot of other people have it way worse. So I'm okay with it.
You're nothing if not resilient. You must really like it there, dude, because I'd have been out of there at the first hint of smoke.
I have recently started to question the decision to live here, but I love wine so much that this is not where I want to leave from. But man, it's getting a little bit tiresome. Yeah, I will say that.
They do ship wine. Just keep that in mind.
They do, but I make wine, so there is some value in actually being hands-on and seeing the vineyard and, going to the crush facility and so forth.
And fair. Speaking of things to drink, you go first.
Yes, because I've chosen a fire-themed drink, and this came from a list of drinks I found that you could set on fire, which, of course, immediately appealed to me. And I'm having what's called a Bailey's Comet, which I've never even heard of before, but when I saw the ingredients, I immediately said, this is up my alley. It's 1.5 ounces of Bailey's, 1.5 ounces of butterscotch schnapps. Excellent. It's 0.75 ounces of Goldschlager. It's a little acid there. And then I didn't do it. I'm going to do it later, but I did not do it here. You put a little bit of 151 rum on top. You light it, and then you put cinnamon in it. It makes sparkly, kind of like little sparkles.
Yeah, just make sure you blow it out, number one, before you drink it.
I'm not that guy.
Yeah. Are you going to take one right here at the outset?
I'm going to drink all of this without the flame and the cinnamon.
Gotcha.
So I will do that, and then later on, I promise to actually make one with fire and see how that goes.
Yeah, get your wife involved in that, because I don't trust you by yourself.
She made this. She's the expert. I've said this many times. So while you describe what it is that you're drinking, I will take this drink.
Mine's not quite as fun as a Bailey's Comet. A clever play on Haley's Comet, clearly, or Halley's, the great Edmund Halley. Since this is a mailbag episode and we're pulling a little bit from just about everywhere, have decided to essentially drain my liquor bar, my bar dry here. I'm having a Long Island iced tea with, I kind of remembered the ingredients, but not quite. So it just turned into that thing where you raise your parents' liquor cabinet as a high schooler, and you just take whatever you can get.
John, you never did that.
I've heard about this.
That's where I first tried cream de menthe. My parents had it, and I was like, what is this green stuff? And I was like,
Yeah, we thought a mixed drink was you just mix it all together. And so it was whiskey and vodka and tequila and rum and God knows what else. But that's basically what a Long Island iced tea is, with a little bit of Coke for sweetener and to take the edge off.
A little bit of lemon, too, if you want.
Yeah, I didn't have any fruit. So it's just lots of liquor and some Diet Coke because I'm trying to keep it healthy.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's certainly important to keep the healthy side with the Diet Coke there at the end.
That's right.
Compliments. I do love a Long Island iced tea. One of my favorite drinks, especially when I was younger. I'd go out to the clubs. That's what I would drink because I'd be like, let's get going. And that is a drink that will get you fired up fast.
They will get you going. Yeah, it'll get you fired up. All right, I'm going to be sipping on that because if I get to my second one during this episode, I think people will notice.
Well, I just drank 3 3/4 ounces of alcohol at once. Now, fortunately, none of that was like straight up rum or vodka. These are all, aperitif kind of things. So we'll see how I fare throughout this.
Yeah, send me a picture when you set it on fire later. I want to see this. If your house is going to burn down, I want it to be from you, not nature.
No, I'm not. That's the one thing I will not do. Me and fire do not get along all that well, so I will make sure to put this out beforehand.
Fair enough.
But tell me what the episode topic is and what's the song.
Yeah, this is a student mailbag issue. We've advertised this a few times over the past week or so, and we've gotten a lot of great questions, as we'll discuss. But given the fact that this is essentially response to like write-ins from people, questions we've received from Twitter and Reddit and email and forum and wherever, I picked the song for this week, and it's one of my all-time favorite artists, a guy named Joe Cocker, the late, unfortunately, but great Joe Cocker, and a cover song he did called Letter. This was a huge hit song in the 60s. I think he recorded it around 1970. There's a great live version of this on his album called Mad Dogs and Englishmen that he did.
He's the guy with like the really grainy voice, right?
Super, yeah. Arguably Britain's greatest like soul rock singer, I think, in my opinion. But to watch a live Joe Cocker performance is basically to see a man possessed. He's spastic and legs and arms akimbo. It's a delight. But I love this song.
There's a Beatles cover too that's famous.
Yeah, A Little Help from My Friends.
Yeah.
His most famous song that he did was probably Feelin' Alright, which I'm sure if you heard it, you would know it. This is why I don't get to pick all the music, because it would all come from the narrowest window of a genre. It would all be like 60s and 70s rock.
You see, this is funny because I would go all for like 1980s or something extremely modern.
Yeah, the music of our childhood. Sort of.
Your childhood is the 60s is news to me.
Yeah. My childhood was growing up, sitting on the floor listening to my parents' records, which were largely from the 60s, yeah.
My parents did some strange stuff. We should pull that out. Some Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass kind of craziness from way back that now I hear, and I'm like, I remember hearing that when I was younger, but I don't listen to it often now.
Different times.
Anyway, given that mailbag topic, obviously we wanted to get to some questions that people have that were really current about the various things that are kind of going on up to the minute, which is interesting because there's a lot of stuff happening right now. Like we know that months and months ago, we talked about the college admissions scandal and Lori Loughlin and her husband and what would happen with them. John, what did happen with them?
They were kind of the two final sentencing holdouts. They were, I think, just about the only two that tried to plead innocent to this and eventually caved to the pressure. They were just sentenced last Friday, I believe. Lori, Aunt Becky, got 2 months in prison, and her husband, who's a fashion designer of some sort, probably past tense, got 5 months in prison. So he got it 2.5 times as bad as she.
I have 2 comments about that. On a relative scale to what other people have gotten for crimes that seem less significant, it's ridiculous that they got 2 months and 5 months. Then again, I'm largely a decarceration proponent, and I'd rather have seen them not get any time and be fined like $50 million.
Right.
That would have made me a lot happier.
Or have,
Put it back to the state.
Aunt Becky in an orange jumpsuit on the side of the road somewhere, picking up trash for, 2,000 hours.
It's a great visual, but at the same time, what do they have? A lot of money. Going to jail isn't going to change anything, in my opinion, especially when you see somebody who's like, oh, I got pulled over and I had an unregistered gun in my car, and okay, now I'm in jail for 3 years. I'm like,
I thought you were going to say like a joint. Unregistered gun, maybe. Like a small bag of weed.
It was the first thing that came to mind. Why an unregistered gun was the first thing that came to my mind. Yeah. Nobody knows the answer to that. I don't know.
Anyway, yeah, that was the update on the Loughlins. Which I'm with you, actually. I agree on both of those things. Decarceration's a good thing. They should have gotten either more or different. Either way, I don't think they were punished sufficiently.
Yeah, I don't like it. I would like to see wealthy people get monetary penalties that give back to the state. Did you watch the Champions League final, speaking of current topics?
I tried to, but I was on the phone with a student for part of it, and I realized I couldn't do both very well, so I turned the TV off.
It was an interesting game.
I caught the second half.
Well, that was pretty good. If those of you don't know, I am a pretty big European football fan, and John, I'd say that you're a reasonable football fan as well.
I'm aware of it.
You're aware of it. I'm a big Chelsea fan, in case anybody's interested. For those of you who have no idea what I just said, I'm sorry to have wasted your time. But Bayern Munich, who is a massive juggernaut this year and had actually annihilated Chelsea 7-1, but then beat Barcelona 8-2 in a single game, which is embarrassing for Barcelona, played PSG, and I'm a PSG fan as well because I love Paris. Unfortunately for me, Bayern won. So that's your European football update.
Yeah, you and Neymar.
Anyway.
Dispute. But there you go.
There's been a lot of controversy over the current mail United States Postal Service situation, so a mailbag topic seems pretty timely right now.
Yeah, it does.
Let's first jump through the LSAT world lineup and then get into the questions that we've received. What's the first thing that's going on in the LSAT world?
The most immediate thing, obviously, is that we have an August test, by far the largest of the year. This is about double the size that we saw in July from the looks of things. And that starts this coming weekend and kind of runs through about half of next week. So Saturday through next Tuesday or Wednesday or so, we'll see the August test begin to roll itself out.
Yeah, and if you are in that last week or two and you're taking that August test, we've got 2 podcasts that would definitely be of assistance to you. Episodes 7 and 9, we talk about the week of the LSAT and the 2 weeks prior to the LSAT, how to study, what to look for, what to do, all the way up to the day before the test. So check out those episodes as being helpful.
I'll add a third to that, too, which is more categorical. Anything that we have talked about to this point in the podcast on test mentality is well worth a revisit. That's largely what the week before the test is about, or at least your performance from here on out largely hinges on your mindset more than some sort of like conceptual revelation.
That is a good reference. Just to remind everybody, because I keep seeing this question come up online, when you're taking the Flex test, you can indeed use the search function, which typically on a Windows PC is accessed using the Control and F buttons, keys. And on a Mac, I think it's Command F,
I believe, yeah.
is what actually does it. But I just want to put a reminder out there that if you're in reading comprehension and you want to search for a term, it is available to you. And I think at this point, hopefully all of our listeners are well aware of that. But I keep seeing it so frequently, I'm like, you're out of the loop. But it does, in fact, work.
There you go.
And then we talked to LSAC recently, last week, talked to them, got a lot of information on some of the stuff that's upcoming here. John, why don't you break it down for us?
Yeah, we got an email from them. I think the majority of which really centered on LSAT writing, which for most people is an afterthought or just some sort of side issue. But what's happening here in the August, and the first thing to be aware of, is that this is the first test that they've done where they actually won't give you your score until you have a writing sample, an essay essentially, on file in their system. You can complete it before the test or after, but you have to have one to get your score when they release. So this is the first time it really starts to matter again. It's been the case for a little while, Dave, that they wouldn't release scores to schools, but you could at least know what you got. This is the first time they're keeping it basically hidden from everyone. So writing has just jumped to the front of the line for a lot of people in terms of what to do immediately after the LSAT.
How many people?
Yeah, this is part of what that email told us. There are around 20,000 of the 30 or so thousand people registered for August who don't have a writing sample on file yet.
So if you think about that, that's a lot. That means the demand is going to kick in relatively soon. Look, writing the essay is not difficult. The one piece of advice I would give to you is try to take it during business hours for LSAC. Because if you do run into a problem, that allows you to call them and get it reset very quickly. Had a couple students this weekend message me in a panic because they were like, it's not allowing me to take it. And I was like, you have to get reset. You have to call LSAC. So that's my big tip is don't take it at 8 o'clock at night or midnight, even though that's when I'd want to take it. If you're a risk taker, do it. But if you're like, look, I want to be able to do it right then and have immediate, correction ability, then you're going to have to go to during business hours for LSAC.
Yeah, ditto Sundays and some Saturdays even. So just, be mindful of that, which is a bummer because a lot of people I know just want to do this on a weekend morning and get it done with.
Yeah, you still can. It's just that know that if you have a problem, you're going to be dead in the water for the next day or two, depending on which day that you choose. Mm-hmm. They also made a point of saying when you are taking your test or your writing to make sure that you are clearing the room of prohibited items. Apparently what's happening is that the AI is flagging some of these sessions, and it doesn't turn out to be negative in the long run. It's just causing them to be delayed in terms of their processing. And it can take a week or more from the completion of your test right now to get finalized. So the last thing you want to do is go take a writing test and then have your phone on the desk next to you. They can see that, it'll identify it, then they will go look at it, and it's just slowing the process down. So it was interesting. I was exchanging messages with them. One of my contacts there is super cool. And he had said, I know you're dealing with these fires. Do you have time for some LSAT stuff? And I'm like, I always have time for some LSAT stuff. I could be driving out of down a burning road, and I would have time for LSAT stuff. So they were very adamant about this being an issue. And, you might be able to get by with certain things from proctors, but they'd prefer that you not do it because they'll still catch it and see it.
Yeah, they're concerned for students. They want to release these scores without issue. This is going to basically prevent that in some cases. So get this done. Get this barrier out of your way. I was a little surprised at the length of time that it takes to turn an essay around. If you had said a week, I would have bet the under on that. But from the time you complete and submit your essay, it can be a week before it actually clears through their system. And that's if you don't do anything to trigger their flagging. The AI that Dave just mentioned. That can delay it
I think it's actually the flagging that's contributing to the delay.
That averages out to a week for people, but maybe.
Yeah, I think they're going through it sequentially. I don't think what's happening here is that they're like, oh, you're finished, there was no problems, you're approved. They don't even get to your essay until everybody in front of you has been processed.
Oh,
At least that's the way I understand it. And let's just say that that's how it is for the moment, which means that if 10 people in front of you had issues, you're waiting for them to get cleared out. Now, they're not doing one essay at a time, so don't get the wrong idea. But even if you're doing 100 essays at a time, every delay causes a delay to the people behind you. So it helps everybody if you just kind of comply with what they want.
Yeah, that ripple effect. If you're not sure whether you have a completed essay on file, the first way to know is just if you've done one in the last 5 years, it's on file. Even if you completed an essay and then canceled your score, it's still there. Presumably, as I understand it. But they are going to send an email, they said, to anyone registered for August who does not have an essay in their system. So you'll get confirmation one way or another.
And this also means that if you took the LSAT 3 years ago and you did the writing sample at the conclusion of the test, you have a writing sample, or LSAT writing as it's now called, on record.
Yeah.
So it grandfathers in from the past. It doesn't have to be a flex or online LSAT writing exercise. It can be from the days of the old written test.
Yeah, the handwritten stuff from 2017 still counts. You'll still get your score here and you're fine.
So we also know that score release is going to be coming up relatively soon afterwards. And they made an interesting point in the message that we were exchanging, which was that, people have been talking a lot about the delays in scoring. Well, now that the flex test takes a week to administer, what's really happening is that from the end of the testing period, it's only taking them about 2 weeks to release scores. And of course, you always see this, especially on like Reddit afterwards. Oh my gosh, the scores take so long to get out. Well, yeah, if you take it on day 1, you're looking at more like 3 weeks. But if you take it on day 6 or day 7, you're looking at 2 weeks. They have tightened it up pretty well. Full credit to them on this. And the August score release date is going to be September 18th, as we know. But maybe think about the fact they have to wait for all those tests for that week to be done before they can start all that processing, and that's contributing to it. I actually wrote a blog about that explained why does it take these digital LSATs so long to show up. So you can go on our blog and actually look for that, and it explains all the different pieces that are in place that have to be accounted for before they can release the scores to anybody.
If you take the August test, regardless of which day, scores are coming out on the 18th of September. Or at least that was their optimistic deadline, they said. That's their plan. Did you notice the language that they kind of used with that? It's like, we're trying our best. We're very hopeful that we can get them out on the 18th as planned. I was like, oof.
Barring some kind of, catastrophe, which I'm not expecting.
You're not?
Praying doesn't occur.
Have you been asleep for the last 8 months?
I'm optimism, John. You know me. I'm all about optimism here. I don't go in thinking the worst. I go in thinking the best. Then later on, I'll parse it out.
What was in that shot?
Leave it. It's going to happen. That shot was good, huh? It's turned me into the happiest person in California.
All right.
It was big, man. That was a lot. All right, let's move on to the mailbag.
Yeah, let's get to it. You've already hit one, which was Control F, so I feel like we've got our feet wet.
We started off, and I want to start off by saying thanks to everybody. I posted this on Twitter. I was like, we're going to do this. If you have questions, please post them here. And we got a lot of good questions there. We got some emails that people sent in, got some Twitter DMs as well. It also kind of triggered a cascade of questions where students came to me and said, I want to ask you about this game from like June 2001 or this reading comp passage from October 1997. I'm doing question 5. And it's funny because to me, I love to answer questions like that. It's actually incredibly rewarding for me to do that. I like explaining things. But I got so many, and I know you did as well,
I did, yeah.
that one of the things that I've been forced to tell people is, hey, if I answer this for you here, it's just between you and me. So if you have questions, we are constantly now directing people to our free LSAT discussion forum. You can post the same question there, and usually relatively quickly, 24 hours, maybe 72 hours, someone will get back to you and provide a response. Right now, it's pretty heavy traffic, so times can really vary. But if someone's asking me a really specific LSAT question and asking me to explain something, I love doing it, but I won't do it privately anymore. I know you won't. We send it to the forum, and the reason we do that is that way everybody can benefit. And since we do it for free, we want everyone to benefit. That's the rule.
That is, the rule. There's another upside to this rule, which is that you're probably not the first one to ask about that particular question. So before you just go posting, search out your own answer. Chances are good it's already been explained sufficiently for you. That's not to deter anyone from posting, but just, again, do the reading first. And if you're still confused, let us know why.
That's really true about the LSAT Bibles too, because they've been around for a while. People ask a lot of questions about that content. I've posted some additional lengthy explanations of various items in those books on the forum. So
yeah, there was someone over the weekend who was asking me about those the most recent games, I think from November of 2019, and she was just stumped. And I was like, well, have you read Dave's written explanations for them here, and here? And I sent her to the forum, and within about an hour and a half, she wrote me back. She's like, oh my God, this makes so much sense to me now. I have no more questions. Thank you for your help. Goodbye. Then that was that. So
I love it. That's why we do it, So, and we're going to keep it free too. That's one of my favorite things, is being able to help as many people as possible. And even if you're not a student of ours in the sense that you're in our course or using our books, it's still available to you. We want to have like as wide of an influence and access for people as we possibly can have, because I think that's the fairest way to go forward. So we're not going to change that. But sometimes I'll be like, me trying to answer you one-on-one isn't fair to everybody else. It's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, I agree. So these are broader.
Right.
What's the first one?
Well, this is a question we partially addressed, but again, it came up in a big wave because there's been some posts in various forums about it. And the question really comes down to, I've been hearing that the LSAT Flex tests that have been administered so far come from the era of around 2011, 2012, 2013, which is basically like prep test 60 in the low 60s or so. If that's the case, does that mean that October is more likely to be from that era, and that therefore I should go start studying those?
And I'm sure the same concern applies to August and November. So we'll broaden this target range.
What's your thought on that, John?
Oh, what's my thought on that? Is that, you and I spend a lot of time trying to predict these things, but what we're typically trying to predict is not where the test is going to come from, but the content that you're likely to see and the nature of it. And whether you're getting a test from 2014, like a February reuse, or whether you're getting some brand new thing, much of which we've seen brand new, actually, in these flex tests. They haven't all been reuses. To me, it's a conceptual focus as opposed to like an era focus. That's my thought on it. If you know how to do conditional reasoning, if you know how to do grouping games, I can give you a game from 2012, I can give you a game from 2020, and you're going to be just fine.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of conversation about like, the 70s and the 80s and so forth are different than the 50s or the 60s. And yeah, there are shifts. They emphasize different things. Sometimes they move towards certain presentations, and sometimes they move away from it. It's really easy to get focused on what, to me, are relatively minor differences between tests, and to then at the same time ignore the fundamental similarity between really so many LSATs, if not all of them. I say this often that logic has basically been the same since they figured it out thousands of years ago. The difference on one LSAT to another may be that, hey, they've already done that 50 times. Now they want to try a slightly different wording variation. And now you have a new way of presenting an idea. It's not really new. It's the same base idea. It just looks different. And so sometimes the nuance of a difference between a test from, say, 60 or 70 or 80, I think is less than it really is in reality. You know, people who are really good at this test can sense differences, but they don't lose their mind over them. They're like, sure, it was a little bit different. And sometimes, as we've seen, logical reasoning at times has gotten very convoluted and a little bit obscure. But then again, you go back into some of really the old tests, very old tests, back into the kind of like the teens of this exam. And there's logic games in there that are as tough, if not tougher, than anything that we've seen, you know, from like, say, 2000 to 2010.
Yeah.
It goes through eras. And there are going to be different emphases. So John said it best. Yeah, they used a bunch of tests from that particular section of the early 60s. They also didn't. They used tests that didn't come from that particular era. And so you can't just say, I should study the 60s. Study the LSATs that are available. Keep to the recent tests if you're right at the very end, because that's the closest guideline.
Yeah, we've said things that I think at a glance or sort of across the room, not fully focused hearing could maybe seem contradictory to one another. You said they go through eras, and I said the test never really changes. Those are both true, frankly.
Yeah, I wasn't disagreeing with
No,
you.
I know
was
you
just
weren't.
pointing out.
I don't want anyone to hear that as like, wait, who do I believe? Because
there's different ways of coming at the same type of
right,
thing.
The emphasis can change, the slight tonalities can change. But number one, again, there's no way to predict where they're going to come from. So as you said, study it all. You should know every test and every concept for the past 10 years or so, in my opinion.
You know, I would say this, that we'd probably agree that 95% of the typical LSAT's all the same. You focused on the fact that it never really changes. The 95% is pretty much the same. And I was like, look, the 5% difference isn't that much.
Right.
You know, and that's the emphases that they go through. So it's really, you know, the same viewpoint through different lenses.
Yeah, and it's not make or break novelty in that 5% anyway. It's only the sort of subtle shifts, the slight gradient degrees of things. Nobody's going to be like, oh my God, I've never seen a game like this. But if I had looked in 2010, that's not how this works.
No, and I've said many times to people, I'm like, the more you study the LSAT, the more you realize that there's nothing new under the sun. This has all happened before. It's all been done in one way or the other. I see small changes, but I don't see huge innovations that are like mind-blowing or like I've never imagined they could do that. There's always an ancestor question and usually a whole chain of ancestor questions to all this stuff.
Yeah. If you only had to take a couple of practice tests, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Let's say this week, you've got 6 days before your test now. I've got time for 2 practice tests left. Should I take 2012s or 2019s?
I would take the recent ones.
I would too.
Although, honestly, you could say I could throw a dartboard and take just about anything and be just as satisfied. You never know what's going to be the turning point. Maybe you do a test from a while back that's got a pattern game on it, and it triggers like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. You get a pattern game on this test, which I don't expect to occur, but let's say you did. That could actually be the key thing. Then you're like, man, I'm so glad I studied those tests from that particular section. You don't really know what's going to happen. And that's the problem with the LSAT is they have this massive canon to go back into that they can say we can pull from all of these things.
Right. The pattern game era, 2014, 2015, 2016, when there was one each year. And then they mostly disappeared since then.
Which is what they do.
That's what they do. So, yeah, I keep telling people, make sure you've got the recent stuff covered. If you want to expand beyond that, by all means, please do. But to me, if you can do the test from 2018 and 2019 well, you can do anything. That's my take.
It's interesting that this comes up, and this goes well beyond what we intended to originally talk about. We're going to keep this section short.
Oh boy.
But this weekend, while I was kind of doing some preparing in case I had to evacuate, I started pulling out old LSATs. And we have a pretty significant test library of old SATs, old GREs, GMATs, and of course, every LSAT back from the pre-modern era, which goes back to like June of 1982. And I was looking at those games and those tests, and I was laughing because I used to spend a lot of time with those back when I first started this, which was be after that, but those were the tests that we had that were available at that time. And the emphasis on sequencing was so huge back then. All these sequencing tests. And then you get into the LSATs in the 90s, they kept up with sequencing, and then all of a sudden it just disappeared. It just went away by and large, and everybody was like, sequencing isn't really tested on the LSAT. Then it came back. This is what happens with different eras. It's not that the test all of a sudden changed and sequencing was this new thing, just that they stopped doing it because everybody got pretty good at it. So they waited until they forgot, then they reintroduced it, which is exactly the kind of thing that you see with pattern games. Years without it, then all of a sudden they're there for a couple of years, everybody gets excited, now they disappear again for a while.
It's a bit cyclical. That's why we've kept our crystal balls, which is actually the next question. Here's a segue.
Yes,
we've kept our crystal balls mostly, I think, focused on here's what you can count on. Here's what we know for sure. You're going to see grouping. You're going to see an emphasis on flaw, must, assumption-type questions, and strengthen, NLR. These are the things that we've really tried to emphasize because those are the things that no matter what era you pull from, but especially recently, we know are going to happen. And so we got asked a question on Twitter, will there be a new crystal ball for August? Now, if you're just listening to this now, I think you probably know the answer.
No.
Well, no, yeah, because it's only 5 days away.
But here's the reason why. I mean, this one's really simple. It's still 100% applicable. We have had no new tests released this year from LSAC, something that I hope that they correct either at the end of this year or sometime early next year. But there's been no new tests to look over and say, is there anything that, seems like a small shift in direction? And then I think more importantly, what we said in that crystal ball was our expectations are along these lines. We think it's going to be middle of the road. We talked about like what is most common. And each time there's been a flex test since that particular point, it has more or less matched what we predicted.
Yeah.
And so I don't see them all of a sudden going crazy here with this next LSAT. So I can't see the extra value that we can add by doing this. Yeah, we could do it.
This was the webinar you and I did, by the way, the crystal ball webinar we did right before the May test, where we had headlined it as May, June, and perhaps July. But obviously, we're continuing to extend it. If anyone was wondering.
I think it's 100% applicable. So for August, no, and that's the reason why. Everything we said still right on the line, and there's no new tests. What do you think about October and November? Is there going to be a crystal ball for those?
Part of me hopes so, because I like doing them, and it would mean that something in August that was interesting had happened, but most of me suspects not. Because it would take something in August that shook us up enough that we felt we needed to go re-explain things or adjust. I'd be really surprised if that happens. I like to be surprised.
I'd rather not be surprised.
But in this regard, maybe not.
Yes. I mean, if there is reason for us to do it, we will most assuredly do it.
Right.
Do I think there's going to be reason? No. And I think that's actually a good thing for everybody. I do feel at some point they're going to start bringing in stuff that is not 100% standard the way it has been, because everything's been very, very straightforward in terms of like, well, we thought there was going to be this much group and we thought there was going to be this much linearity, et cetera. I don't think they can continue that forever, but we're still very early in the history of this flex, period. So I think we're probably going to stay about middle of the road because that works best for this format.
Yeah. So if you're wondering what to expect in August, we've got you covered from the pre-May crystal ball. If you're wondering what to expect in October, November, I think it still applies, but we'll certainly update as needed in a week or so.
Excellent. Let's move on.
Let's do it.
So this is a question about how flex scores are actually being used if you're applying in a later cycle. And we have a few application questions coming up down the line, but it says, if you're testing right now, but you're not using this score to apply this year, will schools treat applicants differently? Let's say they go back to regular testing later on next year, and maybe you're applying for next cycle. And now you're being compared with your flex score to people who have a so-called regular in-person score. Will they treat those differently?
We've actually reached out to a lot of schools and talked to people about this. And the answer, from everything I've heard, and everyone I've spoken to, has been a resounding no. We're going to treat these the exact same. We see them as equivalent. And that's a real testament and credit to LSAC in a way, that this test has been vetted, the flex test has been vetted to the point that schools see it as synonymous.
Yeah, they trust them. and they're willing to say that since the score is on the same scale,
Yeah, that's a good
I'm not seeing any kind of special treatment and certainly nothing negative about it. I think they know we're in a pandemic, and that's pretty much all that needs to be said there. They're like, you took the LSAT, this was the score they gave you. They say it's the same. We're going to go ahead and accept it as the same. We report it. ABA accepts it. U.S. News uses it. We're good to go.
Yeah, the circumstances are special, but I don't think schools are going to treat the results as such.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Next question.
This was a question you got on Twitter specifically, but it's one that you and I both get a lot. You want to read it? You want me to? It starts with "Hi, Dave," so you're welcome to take it.
Hi, Dave. Wondering what your opinion is on taking flex practice tests versus normal ones. Then they go on to give me some background and include the really nice comment that they absolutely love the analytics so far with 3 exclamation points, and I'm a big fan of exclamation points. But the real question boils down to, all right, if I know that I'm taking one of these upcoming tests, should I continue to take 4-section tests, the regular LSAT format, or should I take flex tests? And does it matter when I switch over to that kind of like change when I go from 4 to 3?
That's a good question. I get this one a lot too. And I know this is not the first time you've been asked. The first thing I always say to people taking 4-section tests, whether that's all they have or all they've done, is that they're amazing. They're a fantastic resource. There's nothing wrong with doing more than your test day might actually give you. Overtraining in that regard.
Never.
Yeah. If anything, it just conditions you so that test day then feels a little bit like a day off, or at least less of a burden.
You're building stamina. If you're going to take a 3-section test and you take 4 sections, you're just pushing yourself that much further. It's like overtraining.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And so that was kind of like the gist of my response. I was like, there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. However, at some point closer to the exam, you do want to switch over to the 3-section test just to make sure that nothing surprises you on test day. You don't want to think to yourself, oh, I was waiting for another LR, or I have a second chance at LR, when in fact that's not going to occur.
Yeah.
So in this particular instance, you can't go wrong using either approach. And I would make sure to switch over to 3-section tests probably several weeks at the minimum before your actual test date. But it's not even like absolutely critical as to how far in advance you do it. Just make sure you've taken several 3-section tests prior to the actual one.
Yeah, I'd add to that. Personally, I wouldn't want to only take 3-section tests. If I had to run a 3-mile race, I'd want to make sure I could comfortably run 4. That's how I'd feel.
And you'd want to do some sprints too. You know, build different muscle structures that you have out there.
Single sections, single concepts. There's all kinds of ways that you can reconfigure and reconstruct this. And they're all important and they're all valuable. The 3-section is just the most representative. So do those at least as a lead up to test day as your emphasis.
John, did you just say that you're a fan of CrossFit for the LSAT?
A huge fan of CrossFit. Soul Cycle, Orange Theory. Yeah, this house looks like a Lululemon, man. You'd love it here.
Well, you know, that's really what we're just talking about. Sometimes it's 4-section tests or a 5-section test. Sometimes it's 1 section. Sometimes it's 10 questions and doing a speed drill.
Mm-hmm.
So that really is CrossFit for the LSAT, and I endorse that. So
I actually didn't catch the reference. I don't know what CrossFit entails. I just know people are like fundamentally religious about it.
They do a bunch of different things. It's not the same thing over and over again.
Like, are you really a vegan if you don't tell anyone? That kind of thing. That's how I feel about CrossFit.
There's no such thing as a vegan that didn't tell somebody else that they were a vegan. Yeah. No knock on vegans.
Yeah. Next question.
Leave it on that.
Yeah.
I think I might have a steak tonight. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts, this is from Twitter, on what to do when it seems like you're getting something different wrong on every practice test. I'm so close to my goals, thanks to you guys, but just missing the last couple of points.
Yeah. The emphasis was really not Dave's on so, by the way. There's like 4 O's on it.
Yeah.
You read that as typed, basically.
I like extra letters. I do it myself frequently.
There you go.
Got to communicate.
This is a great question, and another one of the most common ones that we see is what happens when you can't identify a particular weakness or a particular consistent area of, say, difficulty or struggle? What if I'm just missing questions but can't put my finger on the underlying concept or cause? That's what this is.
Yeah, and I think, you go one test and you're like, I missed a bunch of strength questions. And then you go to the next exam and you missed a bunch of flaw. And then now assumption's a problem. And then parallel was an issue.
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't seem like you've pinned down something that's a distinct weakness, what do you do? And if you have a student like that whose score is moving around, my immediate thought is, it's not that those types of questions are the problem. It's not as if it was assumption this time and then flaw. It's that there is an underlying root cause that leads to this. It displays itself in different ways. It manifests differently from test to test. Mm-hmm. For example, one of the first things I always look at in a student's performance is must be true questions. Mm-hmm. It's, at least as far as logical reasoning, it's a big highlight, because if someone shows any weakness whatsoever in must be true questions, it will manifest itself elsewhere at various times. And the reason is simple. If you're having problems breaking down facts, well, guess what? Later on, if you're asked to, manipulate an argument and weaken it, you might miss some facts in the process of doing that, and all of a sudden, your attempt at weakening the argument could be off. Or if you're being asked to figure out what the flaw is, if you miss something that actually occurred, identifying it abstractly is even harder. So sometimes I'm able to go back and say, look, your problem isn't that you're bad at strengthen or weaken specifically. Your problem is you're actually not really good at determining facts. So let's start there. And that's the thing that I would, first off, and I know you have some different advice that I think is useful too, I would say is, what is it really telling you? What's causing this? What's underneath this kind of like surface difference in the types of questions that you're missing?
Yeah, and I think this is the difference in someone like you or me or some expert looking at the results of this, and no offense to the typical person, but the typical person looking at their results, they see the names of questions or they have a feeling about it, but they can't say the reason I'm struggling in flaw is because my attention to detail is not good enough, and I could practice must be true to get better at that. That's a difficult connection a difficult bridge for the typical person out there to be able to build, but you or I could see it. Someone who struggles with weaken, you know what? You're probably not good at spotting argumentation. Go work on main point and just make sure you can do conclusions first. That kind of thing.
Exactly. You can understand it though. Like if somebody's like, I keep missing assumption questions over and over again, and then all of a sudden I missed a bunch of weaken questions, they are naturally obsessed with the idea it's that question.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel natural to say it's actually not that question. It's this other type of question that's the real problem.
It's funny. There's a series of videos that I recorded for our students in the Online Student Center called Question Type Relationships, where I explore this exact phenomenon, basically, about how different types that feel disparate are in fact closely interwoven, plaid fabric, basically. Where how does something like must be true and assumption connect? How does something like weaken and assumption connect, etc.?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And if you are in one of our courses, go search that out, because it is super helpful, and it shows how things that look so different really aren't different. There's over a dozen different types of specific questions they can ask you, but then they reduced into 4 basic families. Mm-hmm. And you start looking inside those families and you think to yourself, wait a second, these are more similar than I realized. And then all of a sudden you start looking at some of the connections between different families and different specific question types, and it becomes a smaller and smaller world. That makes it a lot easier to understand where the problems you're having might actually be.
Yeah, you get away from question types and you get more into just skill sets or, thought processes, which then lead to techniques, and you start to improve collectively, which is the most fun thing in the world. Hey, I just got better at must be true, and would you look at that? I'm not missing flaw anymore either. That's a fantastic type of snowball outcome.
And that's one of those ones where sometimes someone who's like, I'm really struggling terribly, you go in and you fix some of the root causes, mm-hmm. and then all of a sudden their score jumps, 10 points. And they're amazed by it because they didn't think that was possible. And they're like, well, how do we fix all these problems? I was like, we weren't having all these problems. We were only having 1 or 2 problems. When we fixed those, everything else started to look a lot rosier at that point.
Yeah, you treated singularities as pluralities when in fact, really, it was just that thing. There's a secondary aspect of this too, which I think runs parallel to what we're talking about, but like I said, separate, which is that the test isn't built uniformly in terms of difficulty. A logical reasoning section is probably the easiest demonstration of this, where the questions simply get harder, not a perfect gradient of increase, but they get harder as you go. Question 17 in just about every instance is going to be harder than question 3, for example.
Exactly.
And so a lot of people find that once they have the skills and the concepts largely mastered, they still miss certain questions, but less of a type or an idea and more just of a difficulty level. And that's exactly what, I mean, by definition, you would expect. That's what difficulty means. It's the fewer people get them right. So
It's harder.
Yeah. So as much as that may seem like an obvious thing to say, that often is the case. I see this with students all the time. In fact, I had a conversation. That one I had to turn the Champions League final off was a conversation in part about this idea, where she was like, I just feel so good in the beginning of a section, and by the end of it, is it fatigue? Like, what is it? I just am completely beaten up mentally. Like, my confidence is shot. And I'm like, that's because your expectations aren't tracking along with the reality of how the test is built.
It's getting harder on you.
Yep. It's getting harder when you expect that same sense of like accomplishment and reward and almost obviousness that you had in the first 6 questions. It's just not. If you continue to maintain that expectation, you're setting yourself up not just for disappointment, but for self-doubt, for second-guessing, for speed issues, which was her big thing. She's like, I find I'm going so slow because I just don't feel the same way about answers. And I was like, well, let me correct this misconception. You're not supposed to. You can't.
I will point out that when we look at analytics for students, there are different ways that we slice this. Like if somebody comes in and they're like, okay, I'm really struggling with this, and then I see that every question that they're missing is difficult, that's a totally different problem than when someone comes in with the same number of misses, but I notice that a lot of their misses are dipping into like the easy or medium level questions. Because I'm like, wait a second, there's a problem here that's different. It's not difficulty. So you have to actually analyze what's happening for each student, because one person might have the exact same score as another, but what's leading to that score result is different. And that's why we rely on our analytics so much in looking at this and seeing, well, how hard was the question? How did you perform? What actually happened here? Did you get the first 10? Did you go 10-0 and then go 0-10 on the last 10? Or was it 5-5 in each section? Because those are two very different performances that have the exact same raw score outcome.
Yeah, it's a great point. The advice that I gave her was twofold. Number one, change your expectations. I've likened this before to like going on first dates, where in the first 10 questions in a logical reasoning section, there's going to be a lot of love at first sight. You're just going to be taken, swept off your feet, because that's what right answers do. They feel that good. By the latter 10 questions in that section, the last 10, it's really like going on 5 pretty bad first dates, but you just know you've got to go on a second date with one of them. That's how I feel about answer choices. It's like, I got to give one. One of these gets my real number, basically.
Who am I going to go? Yeah. Who am I going to start dating long term is what's happening.
Basically.
That's your decision point.
Yeah. It's the, I think I said to her, it's kind of like a bar at last call. Like, all right, that kind of decision, which is maybe a little more, that might say more about me than the test.
It says a lot about you.
Yeah.
Nothing I wasn't aware of, though.
I know.
All right, let's move on. That was good. I like those answers.
Thanks.
Next question is one that I got on Twitter. It's about memorization. It says, hello, LSAT gurus. I've really enjoyed your podcast and have used and read the Bibles for months with great success. It's always nice to get messages like that. Thank you so much for that. And I'm feeling more confident going for the October Flex. The question comes down to, does your style of studying contain more memorization and theory compared to other test prep companies? I've appreciated all the hard work you put into everything you do, and I could not have gone from a 164 to a 175 without you. Best regards. So pretty cool question. And I think the way to answer this is twofold. There's a memorization part that's here, and then there's and theory, but then there's also the comparison to other companies. And I'm just going to come out very clearly and say I don't pay a whole lot of attention to what other companies do. So I find it, they don't necessarily use kind of like cohesive systems that I'm aware of or comfortable with, and I don't necessarily know why they're thinking certain things. So I'm not going to really address that part of it. John, would you agree that I couldn't tell you what Kaplan's doing right now, other than what somebody might ask me about.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mix this drink very well. I think I just hit the tequila layer. But I do agree. I pay attention to what we do. I focus on our students and those who need help directly from us, and I know we can give it. What other companies are doing, you referenced one. I won't reference any. I don't really care. Aside from saying that I think some do things better than others, that's the best I'll say about it.
That's what I've been able to see at times. I'm like, that company seems to be pretty decent at certain things and other companies and so forth. So I can't really talk about that as a comparison. But the memorization and theory kind of idea, that's really two separate parts to me. And the memorization thing I've been asked about a few times over the last couple of months. And to me, I always find it kind of a funny conversation because in the books, in our course, we have a couple of lists that we're like, hey, memorize these. Conditional indicator lists, premise, conclusion indicators, some causal indicators. To me, it's relatively minor. You know, it's about 4 or 5 lists that someone's going to go through. But I always say right in the books themselves, I'm like, hey, this isn't a substitute for actually learning what it is that you're doing.
Right.
You can't just memorize these words and be done. The reason that we have people memorize a few terms early on is because it's a super fast kickstart to getting really good at something. And it gives you a platform in which to understand the variations of why things work one way or they don't work that way. You know, conditional indicators is a great example. If I say, hey, these are like the 8 most common sufficient condition indicators, that gives people something that they can actually go out and use and probably handle 85 to 90% of problems that have sufficient condition indicators in them. It's incredibly useful. Now, that memorization is a starting point. It's not the end point. It's a helpful tool. And if somebody says, I don't want to memorize it, I always say the same thing. Then don't.
Right.
But here's what's going to happen. By the end of this process, you will indeed have memorized it. Anybody who's good at the LSAT, if I walk in the room and say, hey, go ahead and list out 10 sufficient condition indicators, you want to know how they're going to do it? They're not going to look at a book. They're going to use their memory to recall 10 good ones that they have. So if someone's criticizing memory, I laugh a little bit. And if they're questioning whether or not it's useful, I'm like, yeah, if that was the only goal, that would be crazy. But that's not the only goal. This is a helpful tool, and it is a great jumpstart to get going with where you need to go, which for most people is, I don't have a whole lot of time and I want to get good fast. That's what that tool is for.
Yeah, I'm reminded of that 4-part series we did on flaws as part of this podcast history, where the first 3 were all about common flaws. And we put the disclaimer at the beginning. We were like, you need to know these, whether you call it memorization or just having encountered them enough that encountering them again triggers that sort of memory. You can make it rote with a flashcard, or you can grind your way through it by immersion. But either way, you need to know these colds. And then the 4th episode we did was more entirely really about theory. How does the process work if you don't see something recognizable? So to me, it's always a twofold thing that we couple together. The marriage, really, of you have to have a set of knowledge, and you have to have a way of thinking and interpreting, and a dynamism to this where you're adaptive and it's organic and you react. You have to have both. Anybody who skimps on, I don't like to call it memory, as you said, but skimps on knowledge of the test, whether it's technique or strategy or common construction or whatever, they're simply doing themselves a disservice in the same way they would if they skimped on strategy on the other side.
It's a mixture. You need pieces of each. But the truth is, at least as far as memorization, during the process of studying for this test, there are things that are going to become embedded in your mind permanently, or at least for the next several years. The fact that if is a sufficient condition indicator is a good example of that. Whether you learn it now or you learn it in 2 months, it doesn't matter to me as long as you learn it before your LSAT.
Right.
So I don't look at that as memorization so much as what you called it there, John, which is quite rightly, you're building knowledge. There's very few tests in this world where you don't have a little bit of memory. Even if you're fixing a car, you have to remember, memory, what certain things do, like the oil filter or the alternator or what have you. It's unavoidable. That's part of the process of learning anything.
Yeah.
So
I wouldn't want to go to a mechanic who's just memorized the manual, basically. I'd want to go to a mechanic who knew the manual cover to cover, but also had a lot of experience putting cars together and taking them apart. And had seen some cars and engines he'd never seen before and still been able to react well to those based on experience and, again, knowledge. That's how I look at it. The second part of that. You got to be both.
Yeah, I think so. And you touched a little bit on this, the theory part of it as being essential. The approach that we use both in class and in our books is really one where we talk about the theory behind it, which is really what's the concept? I mean, theory is a word that people use to annoy other people. Like, what's your theory? I'm like, no, what's the concept here? It's really kind of like a concept and then an application. In, say, the logical reasoning Bible, I'll say, let's talk about conditional reasoning. And then after we've learned a little bit about it, I'll say, let's look at some problems that have it. Mm-hmm. And again, this is a mixture of ways to approach things. I am a big believer in understanding the big picture. And in my experience over the years, a lot of the students who go out there and score in the upper 160s and the 170s, they understood why they were making decisions, and they understood why the people who make this test were doing certain things. That comes back down to conceptual knowledge, which really is the theorization and the theory of what we are actually doing.
Right.
So it's never an emphasis on just one. You're trying to use all the different pieces and put them together in a way that it works best for you. Sometimes that's a little bit of memorization, although I would say that is by far the smallest piece here.
For sure.
Sometimes it's going to be theory. Sometimes it's seeing the application of it that really hammers it home and makes it stick. So anybody who says there's just one way to do it or you shouldn't be doing that, I guess I'd question their thinking on this, because you need a little bit of a lot of different things to do well in this test.
Right, including, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, vocabulary. Look, we have to have this conversation, which means we have to know the same words to talk about stuff. If I say weekend and you're like, does that help? We're in trouble. You've got to know what these things are, because we're having a dialogue about the way the test operates. So when someone's like, oh, contrapositive, can't we call it something else if you want? As long as you know what it means and how it operates, it's just going to be harder for us to talk about it if you don't. And this is maybe where memory does come into play. If you don't at least know the basic discussional vocabulary.
It makes it a challenge, but you join a new group of people that maybe are snowboarders, and you haven't spent a whole lot of time snowboarding, you don't really know them. They're going to sound like they're talking a foreign language to you about all the different things that relate to not only their equipment, but the mountains and the skiing experience. Is it memorization at that point to say that you learned their language? No, you learned. That's part of what this process is. And sometimes if you've never heard the word contrapositive, and the easiest way to say it is, well, you do this, you reverse and negate. You memorize that first. Then over time, you begin to learn that, oh, yeah, that's how it works. You then understand the theory and process behind it. So to me, this is a really easy one. I'm like, there's nothing that anyone does that doesn't involve a little bit of memory, but
Sure.
Really that's just learning and knowledge.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Beautiful.
that's the vocabulary side of it. The snowboarder calls it the binding, and you're like, oh, the foot strappy thing. You'll be fine. I mean,
What's
I worry
the
for
edge?
you, but yeah, right. What's the edge? Yeah, that's
Strappy.
probably one to start with.
All right, next question here. This is about accommodations, and I got a big wave of questions as the accommodations process was going through about 10, 14 days ago. And these were individuals that had applied for accommodations, and they were running on 3, sometimes 4 weeks. And so the question is, what's happening with accommodations, and will I be approved? And there's 2 things to say. When you apply for accommodations, you get back a notification from them that says it takes 14 business days. It has not been taking 14 business days recently. It has been taking longer than that. So I've actually said that to them. They are aware of it, but sometimes it's hard in a company as big as LSAC to say it to one person or 2 and then have it changed in the actual emails. They are aware that there's a delay. Everybody is getting processed. They threw extra people into this, but it doesn't necessarily take you 14 business days.
Yeah.
Don't freak out.
Even that alone can be 3 weeks or more, 14 business days, depending on when it starts and stops. So
yeah. It's 3 weeks, but if you're running on 4 weeks, and especially when you apply for this and it's not supposedly guaranteed,
right.
You can imagine the anxiety goes up.
I don't have to
They've also
imagine
had
it.
some.
You and I see it firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have to imagine it. It's also sometimes timeliness affects this. Right now, we're in a peak season. Unfortunately, a lot of people apply for accommodations in the last day or 2 of the deadline. That creates this huge wave. If you have a bunch of people in the department, then all of a sudden the workload, is 10 times greater than it was, that creates a backlog. This flex situation with a lot of LSAC workers being at home hasn't helped the thing. Things go smoothly.
Yeah.
And then there was that storm it went right by Charleston, was a hurricane, turned into a tropical storm up in Pennsylvania, knocked out power right in the middle of when they were trying to get a lot of this stuff out. So sometimes there's reasons for this. So if you have applied, they will get to you. Don't freak out. That's the first thing.
Yeah. And the second thing is, all right, so I'm delayed, but what should I expect once it finally does push its way to the finish line? When they do finally get back to me, what can I expect? And the answer for this, I'm happy to say, is will you be approved? Almost unequivocally, yes.
Yes, and I'll put a little caveat on that.
I was about to,
If
so you
you
go.
have filled out the paperwork correctly and you have a medically supported request, you're typically getting approved. Now, I get messages and people are like, I've read these horror stories. First thing I will warn you, check the date on the horror story. 10 years ago, the situation with accommodations was much worse. It was, in my personal opinion, a crapshoot. You didn't know what you were going to get. You could have what I would consider to be a valid, substantiated request, and you would not get it. That is the old days. Some might remember that LSAC went through a little dance with the Department of Justice. There was a consent decree signed. And after that consent decree, things became what I would call more normal, where if there was a reason, you got approved.
Dance.
And so largely what we have these days is if you did it right and you filled out all the paperwork, you will get approved. And a bunch of those students who were freaking out to me, I was like, you'll get your answer soon. They then got their answer over the next 5 days. And in every single case, they were all approved.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that everyone will be. I'm just saying that if there is a good reason for you and a doctor has said this is legit, it very rarely, if ever, gets denied anymore.
Yeah, in fact, the more typical thing, if you were to have some sort of issue, some snafu, wouldn't be that you were denied. It's that they would circle back to you and ask for more information, or they would ask you to provide some additional piece of detail. It's not that they just give you some sort of like flat out no and then hang up. And there's still an appeal process after that. So I don't know of anyone who's really had to use it. I do know some people who've had to submit an additional form, but that's usually because they screwed something up in the application in the first place.
Yeah, I have one single rule for accommodations applications. Go overboard. Prove your case beyond a shadow of a doubt. Get as much support as you possibly can, and then you will be as confident as possible when the deadline's coming up.
Yes.
All right, let's move on.
Yeah, the final few questions that we have here all, I would say, fall under the umbrella of applying or applications. And the first came through on our blog, actually. It's one I've been getting a lot, and I'm sure we will continue to see as the year progresses, which has to do with really the rolling admission cycle and what happens as the calendar year flips into the January-February test of 2021. Here's the question, and I'll summarize some of this, go just to the end. If I take the November test, the November 2020 test, and want to apply for the fall of 2021, is there room or time for a second attempt if I do not perform well in November? That's the question. Greatly distilled, but that's the question.
Yeah. I like how you took out all the compliments. Sometimes you have to. People say a lot of nice things, and I can't tell you how good that makes both of us feel.
That is true.
For our purposes here, let's say you take November and you want to apply to attend in fall of 2021. Can you take a January LSAT or a February LSAT? Yes. The answer is yes. As far as applications deadlines, one of the things that we know is that every single school in the country accepts the November LSAT. The vast majority of schools accept January, including a bunch of the T14 schools, Duke, for example. There are a few who do not. I wonder if they'll change that this year because we haven't looked at it quite yet. But last year, I think there were 3 schools. Don't quote me, but I think it was 3 schools that didn't accept anything after November. And they were like at the very top. I think Stanford was one of them.
Stanford was one. I remember being really strict about it.
Yeah. So that may change because this is already a weird year in terms of applications. The pandemic makes a huge difference of everything. So I would think on that particular account that we're going to be looking once again at the majority of schools accepting January, many of them accepting February or March as well.
And we saw a lot of
So,
schools last year even soften these deadlines. What was on their website, even what they were telling people for a while on the phone, ended up being a little bit more hard line than the reality turned into.
yeah, they play it by ear. As a friend of mine once said, is like, look, if you have a good applicant applying the day after your deadline, you're still accepting them.
Right.
Unless you're sitting there and you're Yale and you're like, we don't want to hear from you now. You missed our deadline, you plebe. So it's one of those situations where they're usually pretty flexible. Now, one of the things that we do every fall is that internally we contact the top 100 law schools as listed by U.S. News, and we ask them, what is your deadline? Which tests are you accepting? Are there any exceptions? And then we also quote what they put on their website. And those two aren't always in agreement,
Right.
which is frustrating as all get out. And we'll do that again this fall. So it's actually, we're getting pretty close to the season of doing that.
Yeah.
And if you look at last year's and the year before, you will see how many schools will accept LSATs into June and July sometimes.
Yeah.
I had schools this year has said, we'll accept it all the way up into the first week of students attending.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't necessarily schools that were like, what you would think is not in the top half of, the rankings. So we'll do that again. And I think that tells you right away that, if you can do well in November, you want to. But if not, January and February and March are still there for you in many instances. Just check with the school that you're applying to.
Yeah, let me put, and this is going to sound like a lot, but they're quick. 4 very quick disclaimers on this. 1, taking tests into next year does come with a small degree of penalty in rolling admissions. They're not all equal. They're not all equivalent. So if you can get a better score in November or the same score in November versus, say, February, take November. In fact, if you're on the fence, take the earlier test and give yourself a shot at being early. Number 2, there are certain deadlines that this can affect, like early admission, certain scholarships or merit-based things. So you'll want to pay attention to that. Number 3, so that no one gives us a hard time, contact schools directly yourself and ask them what they're going to do. If you take this as some sort of a blanket, like, take your time with it from Dave or from me, that may not be entirely accurate where you want to go. And number 4, Canadian schools are their own sport. So you'll want to look, if you're thinking about applying to Canada, some of the deadline policies and things up there are indeed different than, as Dave said, in this country. So be mindful of that as well.
I think those are all very good. I will say this. Your goal in law school admissions is to apply as early as possible with the highest possible LSAT score you can get. However, for most schools, and again, it's the vast majority, there may be a few exceptions, Berkeley being one that I can think of, it comes down to your LSAT score is typically more important than applying early. So the rule, and I quote this all the time, is better to apply later with a higher LSAT score than to apply earlier with a lower LSAT score. I don't think it's reasonable because I don't think the LSAT should have that type of impact on admissions, but that's the reality of it. And so usually if you can wait a month or two but then end up with a score that's, say, several points higher, it's usually a better situation for you. And the reason is very simple. Law schools must report LSAT scores to the ABA, and they are then used as rankings. Law schools do not report application dates to anybody, and nobody cares. And that right there crystallizes why one is a lot more important than the other.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's stick with applications. This next one's a broader category because we got similar questions from a few places. An email question that I think will bleed into one we saw on Twitter, or maybe vice versa, but it was largely about advice for people that are applying to law school but are a few years, sometimes a decade or more, out of undergrad. And the specific case, if you want me to go through this, is someone who is in their mid-30s and is applying to law school now, obviously 10 plus years out of undergrad, 3.3 GPA, and was wondering a number of different things about how schools treat someone applying for what they would call a non-traditional standpoint.
Okay. Let me take a shot at it.
It's a lot to unpack, and we're going to make it even more as we go, I know. So, you begin, and we'll see where I can come in.
Okay. So, first off, as far as people applying a few years out of undergrad, the definition of a few years makes a big difference here. 2 or 3 or 4, no big deal. You just you're doing everything you would do otherwise. You're getting an academic reference, you're getting a job reference, hopefully your resume is pretty solid, you've done some other things. It's not that big of a deal. Non-traditional isn't 2 or 3 years out of school. Non-traditional is like, yeah, you're 10, 15 years out of school and you are coming back. And the real question inside of this is, how do law schools view non-traditional students? Is it a positive? Is it a negative? And I've heard a lot of non-traditional students come to me saying, I know it's a negative. It is not a negative.
Yeah.
Think about the very word that you're looking at, non-traditional. I've said this many times. You do not want to make a law school class up of exactly the same type of person over and over and over again. You do not want 22-year-old graduates making up the entire class. You want people with different viewpoints. So when you get somebody who is non-traditional, what you end up with is it is actually a positive because they're going to bring a different viewpoint. I actually talked to Mike Spivey of Spivey Consulting about this and some other things we were just chatting about. And his comment was, I look at it as a bump.
Yeah.
You know, it's a slight positive because this is a different type of person. So it's not a negative. It is, in fact, a positive. So also, part of the question that came in was related to families. Mm-hmm. Do law schools look at people who have families and a couple of kids, and are they worried about them? Do they think it's a distraction? So I asked Mike about that specifically because I had my own view of this, which is no, they wouldn't. And he was like, I can never remember looking at an application and thinking to myself, oh, this person has a family. They're not going to be able to do well in law school. It's just not a factor whatsoever. And of course, Mike worked at Vanderbilt Law School, among others. So we're talking about somebody who has a lot of experience looking at this.
Yeah.
So I think when you get down to it, yeah, you're applying from a different perspective. That different perspective is valuable. So that is the first thing that I would say there as far as a non-traditional experience is it's becoming more and more normal these days.
For sure.
We've seen a big increase in the diversity of older applicants applying. This is not a negative. It's pretty normal. Law schools are set up to deal with this. They're not judging you because you've got 2 kids.
Yeah, we saw the huge swing in this in 2016, the Trump bump, as it was called back then, where a lot of people who hadn't really considered law school suddenly turned their eye towards the legal field for various reasons. I think we're seeing it now as the economy takes a bit of a punch in the jaw, where people are turning back to school as other options maybe get curtailed. So, yeah, I think if anything, if you're a non-traditional applicant, you're considering your chances or you're weighing your future, what Dave just said should be a huge encouragement, certainly a relief. You'll have different concerns. You're going to have to relearn how to study if it's been a while since you've done that. Re-immerse yourself in academically dense text, but those are just part and parcel of prep. The application side things, I think you'll be just fine. What about the GPA though? Because this was a part. Oh, sorry. If you have something else, I thought I heard you make a noise.
I'm just going to add this: is that when you look at law school, think about it as law school admissions officers are assembling a team. I can think of it as a football team, like American football. Do they want 80 quarterbacks on the team? No, that would be a terrible team. Even if you had 80 Tom Brady's, you would be like, this team is horrible.
The slowest team in the history of the league.
They're certainly the slowest. Maybe they might be the best looking team, though, in the history of football. But, 80 Tom Brady's, 80 quarterbacks, that's a bad team. You need linemen, you need linebackers, you need wide receivers, you need running backs, you need safeties, corners, all that kind of stuff. And so that's how you're putting together a law school. You don't want everybody to be the same. You don't want everyone to have the same background. You want diversity on all sorts of levels, whether that's age or education or socioeconomic upbringings, all these different things. And there are many others as well, obviously, that play a role in here. So think about it from that perspective, and it makes it a lot easier to understand that your differences actually strengthen your application. They don't weaken your application.
Yeah, it's a feature, not a bug, as they say. This is what we talk about when we talk about writing a personal statement. What you're really trying to emphasize is what makes you special, what makes you unique, and what you can uniquely contribute. And a lot of times, just the simple fact that you've been around the sun a few more times is something that you can uniquely contribute. Or at least that's what I tell myself every morning. That keeps me getting out of bed.
Keep on going around the sun, Johnny.
One more trip.
All right.
So, yeah, I like that. The question that came in as part of this, too, was what are they going to do then about my GPA? My GPA wasn't great, but it was 15 years ago. It's not me anymore, kind of thing.
I always find this to be a really interesting question, and it has partially positive and definitely some sad elements to it. So let's say someone went out 15 years ago and they graduated from college with a 2.5 GPA. Let's talk about two scenarios that come out of there. Now they're applying to law school. The question is, well, will the law school ignore my GPA? And the sad part of this answer is they will not. And that is because of something I said before. They have to report your GPA, whether it's 2 years old, 5 years old, or 25 years old. I hate this rule. Cannot stand the way that it is actually done, but this is the reality. If you have a poor college experience, it will linger. Now, this was part of the sprawling conversation I had with Spivey about this, and he's like, yeah, but here's the thing. If somebody comes out of college last year and they have a 2.5 versus somebody who did it 15 years ago, I look at that person from 15 years ago and think they're different now. So it doesn't have as much of a negative psychological impact. It's negative because you're below their median and the medians are important, but it's not as bad. So I think that's actually a pretty good positive.
Yeah, I like that part.
The second scenario is, what if you had relatively low undergraduate grades, then you went to grad school, nailed it, a couple of years later, now you're applying to law school. Does your graduate GPA offset your undergraduate GPA?
Yeah, and this is bad news too. They don't care about graduate GPA.
Yeah.
Well,
unfortunately.
When I say they don't care, they'll see it, they'll take it into consideration, but it's not part of how they're judged. The credentials that are you that factor into this are your GPA and your LSAT, not your graduate GPA. So it's largely an afterthought at best.
Yeah, and I find that somewhat frustrating, although, the truth of the matter is this: they don't report it, so it's really not as visible to them. The response that you sometimes hear from people is like, yeah, but I got a 4.0. The response that you get from law school kind of professionals is everybody gets a 4.0 in grad school. It's widely considered that graduate school GPAs are inflated and therefore not indicative. Does it hurt? No, of course not. It's not a negative. It's just not the positive that you would hope it to be. It's great that you went out and got an MBA and you have that degree. That is actually a diversity of experience factor. But your perfect GPA there isn't considered to be decisive or somehow fully offsetting of a low undergraduate GPA, which is frustrating to everybody, but that's just the way that it is. So I think non-trads, as they're called when they're applying to law school, have a lot of positives going for them. It offsets a lot of problems that you might have elsewhere in your application. It won't completely counter a low GPA, but it'll do a little bit to offset it.
Yeah, there's certainly nothing about being a non-traditional student that should in any way hamper your dreams, your ambitions to do this. Go for it. Again, you've got a lot to offer that other people just by default can't.
Yeah, and so we get to the very last question here, which was also about applications. Mm-hmm. And somebody asked about the impact of people being connected to the schools. If you're applying to a law school and you have a connection of some sort, maybe you were a prior student there, maybe you're an employee, maybe there's an alumnus in your family. How does that factor in here?
Yeah, I get this question a lot too. Usually I get it from students who are wondering if it's to their advantage or disadvantage to stay put, basically. As they graduate undergrad, should I apply to this law school? What's that going to mean? How are they going to treat me? I had a student a couple years ago, you may remember, Dave. I think he was a Spivey referral, in fact, who was just graduating undergrad from Cornell and was weighing Cornell versus, I want to say maybe Georgetown or something. Mm-hmm. Or Michigan, perhaps. I was trying to figure out what the move to make was. Do I stay? Do I it was mostly a lateral move either way, but a geographically significant one. He ended up
hugely significant.
Yeah. His name was Michael. I won't say his last name, but I actually remember that too. He stayed at Cornell ultimately, but in a way, as we discovered a little bit with him, and as I'm sure you'll elaborate on, that can be a harder bargain than some people realize. In other words, it's not automatically a benefit for the school to know who you are, for you to have been basically on their campus for the past 4 years.
Yeah, I don't think it's a negative.
Right.
There are rumors out there that if you go to the same undergrad as the law school, that it is harder. But I haven't seen that statistically. Nobody I was talking to about this specific question thought that was the case. And of course, if you're applying to Yale, you got to remember they only accept like 8% of applicants.
Right.
So even if you come from Yale, they're still rejecting over 90% of you. Well, that means there's 9 people out there out of every 10 who are saying, I go to Yale and I didn't get in. And then there's one person saying, I go to Yale and I did get in. So the volume of the message is very much so on the negative. And other schools may not have the selection rate that Yale does, but it's still tipped in that direction.
Right.
So there are a lot of rumors about it being more difficult to apply from the same school, but I don't think that is actually the case. It's just that a lot of people are going to get rejected from any good school.
It feels like anecdotal noise in a way. That's just the thing we hear the most from that concentrated group of people because, look, you're applying to a good school.
Now, is it a positive? It's a little bit of a positive, and I'll tell you why. Because what you're saying is, I'm committed to this school. And also, the admissions officers, they typically trust their own schools. They know students at Michigan, or they know the students at Cornell. So they're like, I know we have good students here. So if you're coming out of Cornell and you've got recommendations from professors that I, might personally know, that's a positive. That's going to notch you up slightly. Is it huge? No, it's a good thing. It's another box checked on the positive side and not a negative box being checked.
Fair
so
enough, yeah. I tend to look at the attribute of this, and this is what actually I think swayed Michael into staying put at Cornell, was, look, law school's really hard, and it's a difficult adjustment to make. So if you can start in a place where you're already comfortable, you already know your way around campus, I know the best place to go grab a quick lunch, I know where to do my laundry, I've got a friend group and a support group. In his case, he had family as well. I was like, dude, you're going to be 10 steps ahead of most of your peers who are just getting here and still exploring through the first couple of weeks. That's a big leg up. So academically, I can see a tremendous benefit in this as well.
Now, we also have the question that extends to employees and alumni.
Right.
And there, the benefit really decreases considerably. Being an employee doesn't give you any type of distinct advantage. It's just where you work. You're not there academically, so they're not going to be able to look at you and make certain, assumptions or inferences about your performance. The alumni thing is really big at the undergrad level, especially if somebody gives money. It's less so at the law school level. It's not going to be definitive.
Looking at you, Laurie Loughlin. Looking at you.
$500,000.
Yeah.
What was the thing they said in that case? They're like, oh, they won $1 million. And they laughed and they said, there's no way we're paying that. I'm like, oh, yeah?
You already paid it.
$500,000 anyway. Whatever.
Right. So, at the law school level, the whole, my grandfather went here. That thing doesn't tend to carry nearly as much weight as it typically would at like an undergraduate sort of place.
If that's the angle you're playing up, you're actually showing weakness in your application because you should be able to show a lot more powerful things than that.
You're not on your own 2 feet. You're having to kind of stand on the shoulders of relatives.
Exactly.
Yeah, I feel you.
By the way, a shout out to Spivey Consulting for chatting with me about some of this stuff and just generally chatting with us all the time. So if you get a chance, follow them on Twitter. They're at Spivey Consult, I believe. And on Instagram, I think it's Mike_Spivey. Don't quote me on that, but check those out as well. They're an excellent source for admissions information. And he and I tend to talk a lot. I give him a lot of LSAT information. He passes along a lot of law school admissions information. So we're big fans of theirs, and I think the feeling is mutual.
Very much so, yeah.
John, we've come to the end of the stated questions. Do we have anything else? Anything you'd like to add?
Oh, what to add? No, this was pretty wide-reaching. My only apology in any of this is I didn't drink nearly as fast enough as I thought I could. I've got a lot of work to do over here, buddy. I
did finish that shot at the beginning, but that was like 4 ounces of alcohol. I'm going to wait another hour before I have another one of those. I don't know that was my favorite drink I've ever had on this show.
This is where I wish we were doing this across the table from one another, because to have watched your face.
I'll tell you this much, though. It may be that later on, when Amanda lights the rum on fire and puts the cinnamon in it, it might be spectacular. So, maybe I'll come back next time and be like, let me tell you something. The big mistake was just drinking that without the flaming cinnamon going into it. It could be.
I don't think that was the big mistake, but I hope
I'm wrong.
I hope I'm wrong.
It certainly wasn't the schnapps or the Baileys. Those things are never a mistake.
What impressed me most is that you already had all those ingredients.
Yeah, we got a lot of mixers and various kind of exotic alcohols floating around. Not that I consider any of those exotic. Goldschlager, I've had that bottle for ages.
There you go.
I like a Goldschlager shot every once in a blue
I'm
moon.
sure I've regrettably had a pull on it.
All right, let's go ahead and call it. If you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you enjoy it, leave us a comment. If you have any questions, there's not going to be a mailbag for a while, but please feel free to send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com or post them on our free LSAT discussion forum. We're often there answering questions as well. On behalf of John and myself, stay safe out there. We will talk to you soon. Have a great week.